That I read over the last 3 or 4 weeks, I've told you about some of them, is the book on the year of the pitcher, 1968. Sridhar Pappu wrote it. That was a book that was recommended by Sean McAdam. He, of course, our pal from Boston. Denny McClain, obviously Bob Gibson. Don Drysdale's 58 2/3. A lot going on in a wonderful year of pitchers. Sridhar, of course, lives in Brooklyn. It's his first book, and he says hello. Welcome. How are you today, pal?
I'm great. How are you?
Okay, very good. Hardcourt Mifflin was the publisher. It came out last year, but it's perfect here, Sridhar, for the 1968 season, the 50th anniversary of that great year, right?
Yeah, it's yeah, we're starting this tomorrow, which is unbelievable.
Oh, really? Oh, very good. So you wrote it last year. I mean, it comes out it's been out for a while, right?
It's been out for a while, and now we're marking the 50th anniversary.
Oh, that's how you're doing that. Now, again, Gibson, you love to get a hold of Gibson and try to. And Drysdale's passed away.
Yeah.
And Gibson, you can't. He's very difficult. But you had McClain, so you had to write a book, 68, about a great era of pitchers. But it wasn't easy to talk to the participants. And Johnny Sain passed away, a great pitching coach. So you had to do a book based on not having a lot of the guys get a chance to talk to, which is tricky, and you accomplished that. How about that for a sec?
Yeah, no, it was challenging, and as time goes on, even the people that you talk to, I think maybe 5 or 6 passed away from the time I started.
6 years.
Yeah, including Phil Pepe, who was great, who was Gibson's first
biographer.
Yeah, so. You just do your best. You call every single person that might have been on either of those teams or might have known those people. I talked to Bill Fitch, who, as you remember...
Which is a fascinating story, which we'll get to a little bit. Fitch, of course, was with Gibson at Creighton, was it not?
Yeah.
And Fitch, of course, the legendary not legendary, but a heck of a basketball coach who did him. Who else? Go ahead.
Let's see, Bill Fitch,
a lot of the Tigers.
A lot of the Cardinals. Obviously, Tim McCarver can talk a lot about Bob, and because of their relationship over the years.
Did you try to track down Bob and get him to get to a phone? How'd you handle the Gibson angle? I know he's tricky, and he's a good guy, but he's quirky, and if you don't get him at the right day, you're never going to get him. How'd you handle that?
Well, I had the great fortune of being introduced to Rodney Weed, who he grew up with in Omaha and remains best friends with to this day. And a number of people tried to get letters to him, and he just didn't respond or said no. And towards the end of the book, I finally meet him.
He went to California to do it at a card show, was it not?
Yeah, and Denny and Bob were supposed to be there. Denny wasn't there. No surprise. And I sort of got blown up. Well, I did get blown off by Gibson, but I did my very best to try and capture the guy. And including talking to Rodney, who there was a very fun, one of my favorite moments from the reporting of the book was I was meeting him in the West End of St. Louis, and I see his car pull up, and he just sort of says, hold on, and he said, I'm sorry, that was Gibson talking. He will not shut up. And he said, I said, except to me.
Yeah, very tricky. And Gibson, let's do Gibson first. Then we'll do McClain and then do Drysdale. Gibson, obviously, tough life, a tough period of his. He hated the manager early with the Cardinals, Sally Hemus, couldn't stand him. But, he loved Fitch, who was his assistant baseball coach at Creighton. Wasn't he like a baseball coach at Creighton, if I'm not mistaken, when he was there? Was that what it was? Fitch had a relationship with him in college.
Yeah, he was the assistant basketball coach. And then he was also the head baseball coach.
Oh, he was the head baseball coach, so that's what it was. So there's the Fitch thing. So, he loves McCarver. But he's got he had a rough life. So this is a guy that is borderline sometimes. He doesn't want to deal with the media whatsoever, but when you get him in a good situation and you talk to people who have talk to Gibson, you get good stuff out of him because he's thoughtful, and sometimes you can't shut him up. He's kind of a weird guy from that standpoint.
Yeah, and everyone you talk to who is close with him will say, he's very tough, but once you get to him, he's an extremely loyal human being, and like you said, thoughtful. And really has thought a lot about his life and about where he came from and how he's perceived, and I mean, to a certain extent, for a man who had such a tough life and has this persona of being so distant, I think he kind of likes it. In fact, his other ghostwriter, Lonnie Wheeler, who I talked to extensively, said he's developed this again persona within baseball circles of a man that is feared and must be feared. And he sort of kind of relishes that and enjoys his privacy. And
he likes to throw inside and all those kinds of things. And Johnny Keane is the guy that really got his career on track. The Cardinal manager, 64, they won the championship. He pitched Game 7 against the Yankees. He pitched one that series. That really, now I don't remember what he did in 63, but that is really the year where Gibson became Gibson. Let's do that for a sec.
Well, that really is. I mean, if everyone remembers, and David Halberstam captures perfectly in October 1964 in his book, the Cardinals came back from, I want to say 15 games.
They were 6.5 back, 10 to go.
With 10 to go. And Gibson was the guy down the stretch. And then in the World Series was great against the Yankees in his second and third starts. Ends up capturing the World Series MVP. And Johnny Keane said, Hoot, you're on your way. And with that, Keane was on his way, here to New York.
Yankees. And don't forget, Keane let him pitch in Game 7 in the 9th inning when he'd given up a couple of home runs because he trusted Gibson to get those last couple of outs when the Yankees were rallying in the 7th game in St. Louis. So he showed great faith in Bob Gibson.
Yeah, and I think one of the things he said is, I trusted his heart. And, from then on, he had a manager in Red Shadings who he trusted, and he trusted him. And I think that was one of the big things in Gibson's life. If you showed faith in him, if you showed a belief in him, he was going to reward you. And what he did from then on, from 65, 66, 67, 68 is culminating in 68 with that obvious 1.12 ERA. Just shows that how great of a pitcher he was, and why we revere him to this day.
And you spent a lot of time on 67 too, when he had to win that Game 7 in Fenway Park when Dick Williams said lobster and Lomborg, and Lomborg pitching on 2 days rest, forgetting that Gibson was the guy that he was pitching against, and Gibson mowed down the Red Sox in a game that, listen, the Red Sox were down 3-1, and Gibson took them out in Game 7, solidifying his big game persona by shutting down. They won 7-2 by shutting down the Red Sox in that 7th game.
Yeah, and
you spent a lot of time on that. You did a big thing on that in this book.
Well, yeah, and to come into Boston and to feel unrespected, and he really thrived on what he saw as disrespect of
perceived
other people.
Even at times.
Yeah, perceived. And he comes into Boston, Game 7. The Red Sox think they're going to win, and it wasn't even close. And in talking to Jim Longborg about that game, he said, I knew it was over when Dow Maxwell hit a triple.
Early in the game.
Early in the game. And he said, that's it.
And he was pitching on 2 days rest, so we'll give Lomborg a little credit. We'll give him a little break on that. But once you gave Gibson something to work with, you're in a tough spot in that scenario.
Yeah.
So Gibson, and then of course we go to 68, where the mound is obviously, they lowered it after the 68 season. So the trend was there. The Dodgers had great pitching, weren't a ton of runs. The trend was there of this great pitching over the Orioles in 66 had great pitching. The trend is there of the dominance of the pitchers in the 60s, culminating in 68. Then they said, we got to do something about this. But there was a great trend in the 60s of the great dominant pitcher and the great staffs. How about that for a sec?
Yeah, I mean, it really begins with an overreaction to Mantle and Maris in 61.
Oh, okay.
And then, of course, Tommy Davis's great season with the Dodgers in 62. And so the forces at work in baseball said offense has become too dominant, something we're never going to hear again. They changed the rules, and you can actually track it through the 60s. With the rise of pitchers, obviously Koufax, Drysdale, Marischal, and with the emergence of guys like Gibson, and then it all coming, together in 1968 when hitters just couldn't do it out there.
And Davis had a great 63. Did not win the MVP. Maury Wills did, but Davis had 140 RBIs, 140 home. I mean, he had an incredible year. And then, of course, 61 year Mantle and Maris. So as a result, then they said so the powers that be in that little period there, 61 and 62, were fed up with all the offense and they wanted to make it more of a pitching scenario?
Essentially, to make it more fair. But by 68, then it wasn't fair.
No, it wasn't. By 68, we went the other way, and of course we saw it happen in 68. Let's start with let's go to Denny McClain for a sec. Strange guy. He had good years, but a very strange character. Used an awful lot. Great curveball. Johnny Sain, the whole bit, was his pitching coach. A totally different character than Gibson. How about a second or two on him?
Yeah, I mean, if Gibson wanted to be this unknowable person, and the stories are out there, of course, about him not talking to other players from other teams at All-Star games and stuff like that. The world knew who Denny McClain was, or at least the parts that he wanted known were. In a lot of ways, he was kind of ahead of his time. He saw himself as a brand, just as Joe Namath here in New York was building his own brand. McClain was a little off, though, because he believed that his pitching greatness would lead to a career playing the organ.
He loved playing that organ. Yes, he did. A lot of nightclubs at 2 o'clock in the morning playing that organ, too.
Yeah. And, from the time he lost his father when in his teens, he just developed this recklessness that never really left him. And he always thought, I think, that, as long as I could perform on the mound, as long as I delivered, that he could do whatever he wanted. And, for the most part, he did. I mean, and then when you can't perform on the mound and when your baseball career is suddenly over and your career playing the organ is not going to happen, that's when troubles really, 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 really start.
And Johnny Sain, a great influence. Sain, of course, Spahn and Sain prayed for 2 days of rain. I mean, Sain was a big pitcher in his own right and a very good pitching coach who traveled around a lot of places. He went to a lot of teams, never lasted very long in one city, but a hell of a coach. A lot of influence on McClain. How about that?
He did, and I don't think people have asked me why you put so much John Sain in this book, and I said, you can't talk about the year of the pitcher or the golden age of pitching without talking about Johnny Sain. I mean, you think about the teams he went to. He came to the Yankees and worked with Whitey Ford and Jim Bowden and that staff, and then goes to the Twins and Jim Cott and Mudcat Grant, and arrives in Detroit with a very talented, very young, great, good pitching staff that is just hasn't put it together. And he works with McClain as well as Mickey Lilich, who ends up being the hero of the 1968 World Series, and really more psychologically than anything else. He was a mechanical guy. He believed in certain things and was sort of ahead of his time in sort of thinking about the idea of movement and the rotation of the ball. And he had this great spinner, which was basically a baseball lopped onto a handle in which you could show the different ways you could rotate a ball. But he was a guy that could tutor McClain, and McClain would listen to, and for counsel and advice. And I don't think the Tigers would have come close to the pennant had John Sain not been there.
Yeah, Sain has got a lot more influence on McClain than any pitching coach had on Gibson in 1968.
Oh, certainly. I sort of feel like that Gibson viewed his pitching coaches in the same way that he viewed McCarver as a
I know what
catcher.
I'm doing. Leave me alone.
Yeah.
You catch, I'll pitch, right?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
And then, of course, you got Gibson. Then you have Drysdale in 68, who you don't spend as much time on here, but you spend a lot of time on that unbelievable streak of the consecutive innings, which obviously Hershiser broke shortly there, 30 years later, 20 years later. But you do a lot on Drysdale, and this is after Koufax has left. This is the year that Drysdale sort of separated himself from the Koufax shadow, because he had been in the Koufax shadow a lot in his career, but this kind of set him apart. How about the great run that Drysdale had in 1968, too, at the Dodgers?
Well, it was phenomenal, and little do we know that that his career would end, in 69. And so all of a sudden it starts, and he pitches 58 and 2/3 scoreless innings, and throughout that streak really solidified himself, sort of his Hall of Fame bona fides, but also again emerging from Koufax's shadow, becoming the guy in LA. as that era of LA baseball was ending.
Yeah, that's a good point. The Dodgers are a pitching organization. They've always have been, but in that scenario, he was the remnant of the 63 team that won, the 65 team that won, and the 59 team that won. And so, they didn't win in 68, but he was the guy that made you think back to those old great Dodger pitching staffs when they kind of scratched out a run, and either him or Olstein or Koufax went 8 innings and won a game 2-1 or something along those lines.
Yeah, and the very last Brooklyn Dodger to play.
Yeah, that's true. He played in Brooklyn, and they were all gone by 1968. What was the key with the Drysdale streak? We all know all the shutouts. It was in June, if I'm not mistaken, right? Correct?
Yeah.
And we all know that Wendell started home plate with Dick Dietz, which is a famous thing, which we'll get into. When did we begin to think in 68 that something was special brewing as far as Drysdale's consecutive inning thing was going on?
It's hard to pin down because so many people were pitching shutouts. I don't think you could point to one particular game where you said, like, oh my, but but there is a certain point where people started looking up at the box scores every day and said, he's getting closer. He's getting closer.
What was I don't even know what the record was. You know what the record was prior to 58? It was in the 50s? I had to go look at what the record was before he broke it there in 68.
It was in the 50s, yeah.
It was in the 50s.
Yeah.
So, and obviously it was about, let's see, it's got about six, 7 straight shutouts in a row, correct?
Yeah. And at one point, this is talked about in the book, Robert Kennedy begins his victory speech in California after winning the Democratic primary, and had scrawled on top of it, to congratulate Don Drysdale, and we know what happened immediately afterwards. So that the two are tied. I mean, they've been friendly through various connections before, but because of that, Drysdale and that speech and Kennedy are tied together in history forever.
Now, there you go. Sridhar Pappu, great book, The Year of the Pitcher. We continue at 19 after the hour. Don't go away here on Mad Dog.